Hello, hello, everyone. I'm sitting here with my teacher, Rolf Gates. I'm so excited. And he is our guest speaker this week for Sober Girls Club. We're pre-recording this, obviously, so you're watching it when we're joining in the meeting. But I'm so excited to have Rolf here. I think he has a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge around both practice and teaching yoga and also living as someone in recovery. So he has a lot of wisdom to share. Welcome, Rolf. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. It's good to be here, and it's pretty delightful to be able to witness the work you're doing in the world.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so nice to have you here.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could just kind of start off with like a little bit of context for, what is yoga for us?
Yeah, sure. I guess the backdrop is that um, I'm the director of the Kripalu School of Yoga. So that's like a big title for a big operation. We run about 25 trainings a year out of Kripalu, which is in the Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts. It's about a 50-year-old organization, and it's very steeped in. It was started by Swami Kripalu. It's named after the Swami, and so like the teachings of Patanjali, the teachings of Tantra and Hatha Yoga are big at Kripalu. It's like an old school yoga scene. And at Kripalu, the ground upon which all of this is standing is a philosophy called Sankhya. And Sankhya believes that our true nature is wholeness and joy, and that our stories, which they call vrittis, some of you may know, be familiar with that term, our stories keep us from the experience of that wholeness and joy. And so the Sakya folks, the yogis, had a whole system for working with their stories. But where modern kind of yogis first encounter this work is in Buddhism and Patanjali, the classical yoga work and Patanjali's work. Imagine if, so the first three lines of the Yoga Sutras is, and now I begin to guide myself into the present moment where the war in my mind will cease and I'll be able to rest in my true nature. Another way to think of this is they're saying, and now I begin to guide myself into the present moment where the stories will cease and I'll be able to rest in my true nature. And so you can see the direct relationship between Patanjali's path and Sankhya philosophy. And the same can be said of Buddhist philosophy. Like the phrase for suffering in Buddhism is to be stuck like a wheel in mud in a perspective that causes suffering. Another way to think of it is to be stuck like a wheel in mud in a story that causes suffering. That may be familiar to some of you. To be stuck like a wheel in mud in a story that is causing suffering. And so both Patanjali, chronologically and structurally, Patanjali and Buddhism were kind of working with, okay, if that's the problem, how do we release the stories? And so the release from, in Buddhism, the third noble truth is literally abandoning clinging to that story. And then the fourth noble truth is the lifestyle that you build around abandoning, clinging to our stories. In the Patanjali eight limb path, it's a little bit more of the cultivation of present moment awareness. Makes you can either use your knowing mind or your thinking mind. The thinking mind creates stories. It creates a past, a future, a self, and thoughts about the self. The knowing mind can smell something, taste something, hear something. And so Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is about really changing the activity and structure of the brain so that you're using the knowing mind more often than the thinking mind. And so that's more of a physiological fix, and Buddhism is a little more of a psychological fix, but both systems do both. And so I see myself directly in that inquiry of, is it my stories that cause me suffering? And when my stories cease, when I'm in present moment awareness, do I sense a connection? Einstein said, through an optical illusion of consciousness, we believe ourselves to be separate from everything, and the separateness forms a sort of prison for us. When my stories cease, do I feel myself stepping out of the prison and into the light? Is that true? And so that's like, to me, that's the fundamental challenge of a yogi is, and it was kind of it was given to us from Sankhya, and then these systems were built upon it.
Awesome. I love that context that you're coming into this with, because I feel like that's such a big, I mean, I know for me personally in my recovery journey, and I'm sure for a lot of people that are here, that's a huge thing, is like our stories in this narrative. And it becomes so massive for us that we don't even, I think we don't even know what's happening sometimes, because we just think that that is, our stories are like reality. And I'm wondering, like, how, if someone in recovery is listening to this, like, how can they use yoga to kind of break that that circuit, these stories, and start to cultivate more self-compassion towards themselves?
Well, I guess the good and bad news is it's a lot less woo than it used to be. Initially, when I cut into yoga, there wasn't decades of research of watching the brain in an MRI, but now they really know, what's happening when we're lost in our stories in the brain, and what's happening when we're present in the brain, and they know the 10 principles of neuroplasticity. So a way to think about what's happening in a typical yoga class is you're using the thinking mind less and learning to use the knowing mind more. The knowing mind is empty of the stories. Like you can't taste soup and think about tasting soup at the same time. And so at a very kind of rudimentary level, you're just developing the habit of being present more often and lost in your stories less, just by going to class. Now, mindfulness practice allows you to engage with the stories and start to tease out when they're arising, you're not just diving into an in-breath and an out-breath. You're spending a moment kind of reflecting as opposed to reacting to the story. Does that make sense? And
Yep.
so there's this progression from, I would describe, for lack of a better phrase, kind of a concentration practice, like you're doing mantra, or you're doing breath work, or you're doing asana, is restructuring the brain so that you're going to spend more time present, less time in your stories, but you're not really looking at your relationship to the stories themselves. I think the 12 steps are a good way, like the fourth step and the turnaround, and the fourth step and fifth step. It's very brilliant in terms of getting someone to realize that they've been telling a story all their life and believing it. And then they've been an actor in that story. And there's more than one way to look at things. And so I think of mindfulness as taking something and looking at it from different directions. And so there's this kind of cultivation of presence that's a part of Buddhism and yoga. But then there's also this cultivation of wise reflection on the stories themselves. And there's we have the Western psychodynamic work that's being successful with addicts. I think it's, what is it, cognitive behavioral theory now? Is that what it's called?
Yep.
That's like examining the stories and developing some distance from the stories. When you're in a sharing circle and people are telling their story, you get to kind of sit back and look at your own story from a different lens. And anytime you're not identifying with a story and you're just reflecting on it and learning from it, this is mindfulness. And so you can see how what's interesting about 12-step program, we're still working with our stories to get back to the wholeness and joy.
Right.
And I think these are all very effective modalities. You sit with a therapist and you kind of analyze the story. You go to meetings and hear 30 other stories in your own. Or you're sitting in a practice with a subtle mind, and the vrittis start to arise, and you start to see the patterns. Humans are fantastic pattern recognizers. And so if you're spending some time in meditation, same time each morning for a few weeks. And you may not think you're doing that well, but you'll start picking up patterns. The same as if I put you in the forest, the same place for an hour each morning, you'd start to know which birds do what and which squirrels do what and which trees do what and what the wind is like, what direction it prevails in. You start to recognize the patterns of the forest. And this is what a mindfulness person is doing with their stories. You're like, oh, this story comes in, I feel like this. This story comes in, I feel like that. I tend to like these stories more than those stories. Like I like my revenge stories, or like I'm in trouble stories, And it's just like and you'll find that you have an inclination towards a set of stories, and those stories tend to be they're the frequent flyers. Um, and so that's like, to me, that's like next level from that, like, what are the basic experiences you have in a practice based on that formulation we got from Sankhya, where, okay, our true nature is wholeness and joy, our stories are getting in the way. Then you have like the modalities that have been successful with addicts. Addicts go to therapy and kind of deconstruct their stories. Addicts go to meetings and deconstruct their stories. Addicts learn to meditate and observe the stories come and go like clouds in the sky, right? All of those things work. And I think where we're headed in this conversation is, well, what about self-compassion? Like, how does this, I get how this work that we're doing, the asana and the breath work in particular, create that present moment habit, right? And then the meditation cultivates that relationship to being the sky, not the weather, being the sky, not the stories, right? Okay, I get all of that, but how does that make my life feel a little easier for myself? How do I develop some kindness? I'm pushing on because I know these topics are lengthy, and I want to make sure that we get this done in a fair amount of time.
Yeah.
What I was taught, so I developed that like present moment awareness through my breath work and my poses. It's called concentration practice because you learn to concentrate in the present and not get distracted by your stories. We're talking decades, decades of developing the habit of being present. And some work around self-awareness through mindfulness. So I started to be the sky, not the clouds. The stories moving in and out without identification. It's called grasping. You grab onto a cloud and make a self out of it. But I didn't have any self-compassion. So I would be angry with myself for being angry, or sad about being sad, or pissed about my mind wandering. I didn't have, it's called the second dart, when something arises and then you throw a dart for having, you're jealous and then you're upset with yourself for being jealous. That's the second dart. And so that creates a lot of disruption. Now you're having regular human suffering, and then you're throwing a second dart after yourself. Your meditations are going to be kind of unpleasant. And
Mm-hmm.
my teachers were like, how do you diffuse that second dart? You're still going to have a regular array of human challenges, but do you have to hate on yourself for having them? Which I think addicts are great at, is hating themselves for being human. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so what they taught us was literally forgiving yourself for making mistakes, for being imperfect, and having to learn about life through living it. And so I literally was taught to go back in 10-year increments and let a situation come to me where I felt that I kind of violated my, like an example was as an elementary school kid, I was part of a clique, and I find cliques super distasteful. And I just don't like in groups and out groups. That hurts my heart. And so the fact that I participated in an in group, I had shame around. Believe it or not, I'm like, dude, you're in third grade. But I had shame as an adult about how, I felt like, oh, if I could make amends to these people in fourth grade, go back to Jimmy and say, look, man, I'm really sorry about like being a cool kid, but I was holding shame. And so my teachers told me to go back and feel what it was like to be in third grade and kind of reckon with the fact that I was 9 or whatever, and then forgive myself for making mistakes and being imperfect and having to learn about life by living it. And that was fair enough. Then you get into adolescence and, all hell breaks loose, right? And so you have like bigger issues to forgive, But as you do the work, you realize that um, just like we do with our parents, eventually we see that we're doing the best that we can with the hand that we're dealt. You know, that being 16 doesn't mean, like if you knew what you knew now, then you would behave differently. But you only know what you have to learn about life by living it. Now I have an 18-year-old and a 21-year-old, and I'm watching them learn about life by living it. Does that make sense? And they're not listening to me. Now I'm like, dude, you could go, you could try this, but they have to learn about life by living it. And so, uh, self-forgiveness practice was like in the third step, they say all you need to do is crack the door of willingness. There's that line of cracking the door of willingness. And I think it's 12 by 12. Self-forgiveness practice kind of cracked the door of willingness in my own recovery to letting myself off the hook. And what's amazing is if you let yourself off the hook even a little bit, you're willing to let everyone else off the hook a lot of bit. It's a game changer. It's like the moment I started just treating myself with a little bit of respect around the fact that maybe life is hard and maybe making mistakes is okay and being imperfect is okay. And maybe that's all part of the plan because that's how we are, you know. You just soften around others. It's just if you're letting yourself off the hook, you don't want to put anyone else on the hook. And so it becomes it's a huge refuge for people. I understood first things first. I understood one day at a time, but I didn't understand live and let live. I'm like, why is that even up there? And at like 10, 15, 20 years of sobriety, judging others had become like apparent to me as like, this is a real problem. I don't need to be someone's judge, but how do you stop judging others? The way that you stop judging others is stop judging yourself. And unless you forgive yourself, unless you kind of tone down the rhetoric of self-judgment, you cannot tone down the rhetoric towards others. And those people walking around judging others harshly, they're just that one finger pointing this way, three back is real. And so I have even compassion for the haters, because if you're really hating on the world, it's because you're hating on yourself harder. And you unpack all of that with self-forgiveness. So the Brahma Viharas, which are kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity, are not like kind of a side dish. There really are probably the most skillful way to deal with your stories is to develop that kindness and compassion towards yourself, joy in your victories, equanimity in your stumblings. So I can't tell how long I've been going. So I'm going to stop for now.
I think we're coming up to the 20-minute mark. Wow, this has been it feels like it's been so perfectly timed with like what I'm learning about and teaching right now. And I feel like so relevant to everyone that's tuning in. And what I really love about what you do, Rolf, is like you're bringing in so many wisdom traditions in your teaching and weaving them together in a way that I feel like it really comes to like a key message of like, it's really self-compassion seems to be so rooted in like the stories that we tell ourselves. And if we can release that is the key for a lot of things, for freedom, for joy, for self-compassion, for gratitude.
Nice. Well, it was so good to be here. And thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for your service.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you soon.